Early modern Anthropocene today. We've got about 5 speakers, and we've also got a paper that Beverly Sherry has circulated in advance that we will be sort of reading, or will have read, and then we'll be kind of referencing as we go. I should also mention that we will be recording the sessions just so we can circulate it. So if anyone's not comfortable, they're more than welcome to turn their camera off. And also it means that I can actually watch the end of this back later on. So we're going to split it up into 2 parts. So the first part, we're going to have 3 speakers, and then we'll take a short break. We're going to have some questions and comments, and then we will conclude with Liam and John, and then we will have another section of questions and comments at the end. So our first 3 speakers are Victoria Bladen from the University of Queensland on her new book, The Tree of Life and Arboreal Aesthetics. Claire Hansen from James Cook University on Reef, seabed and shipwreck, blue spatial imaginaries and oceanic entanglements in Shakespeare. And then Killian Quigley from Australian Catholic University on his book manuscript, The Vast Unseen Mansions of the Deep, Submerged Poetics, 1600 to 1820. And then after the break, we'll have John Seven from Macquarie talking on operatic entanglements with the natural wells of Merry Wives of Windsor. And then Liam from University of Sydney will go last on his new unit of study, SLAM 4003, Meaning in the Anthropocene. The papers will probably be around 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll just move quite quickly through them, and then we'll have some question and comments at the end. Okay, so Victoria, I'll mute myself and hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Liam and Ruby and everyone for organising this. So I am going to share my screen now. So hopefully, can you see that now? Yeah, nodding. Okay, great. Yeah, so look, I'm super excited about being able to tell you about my book coming out. So it's The Tree of Life and Arboreal Aesthetics in Early Modern Literature. This has been a very long project. So probably quite a few of you have heard me give papers at various conferences on different stages of this. So it started off as my doctoral research, and then I did some further research, and it's coming out with Routledge's series on world literatures and the environment. And they tell me that it's headed off to the printer and it's going to come out at the end of October. So it's very, very exciting. So yeah, so the book, and they let me put 20 images in. So that's really exciting. So the book starts off with I kind of look at the iconography surrounding the Tree of Life. I won't have time to go into too much detail, but it certainly looks at ideas of the fall, which Beverly explores in her paper, and basically looks at kind of the dualism of the Tree of Knowledge and the Tree of Life. It includes one of the images actually is really interesting. It's not this image, but a 3D model version of the Ruthwell Cross that a medieval team had worked on. So yeah, it's this idea of the Tree of Life as a key symbol in a medieval and early modern thought. Here's an example from the doors of the York Minster, where the idea of the vine is a symbol of Christ and kind of new life through the Christian sacrifice, etc. So the book looks at different aspects of the Tree of Life, religious aspects and political aspects. Here you can see the tree is kind of articulating ideas about the fall, and then the New Testament, the new life through Christ, etc. And then I look at a series of writers. So there's a chapter looking at the poetry of Herbert and Vaughan and how they use the Tree of Life in their religious poetry. This is an example where you kind of get in the early modern period this interesting flip with metaphors. So instead of the Tree of Life being a metaphor for Christian ideology, all of a sudden people start to see mystical trees in landscape. So it becomes really interesting kind of explorations in early modern literature. So yeah, so then there's a chapter on Shakespeare, looking at his use of trees in Titus Andronicus and Cymbeline. Then I look at the work of Andrew Marvell, looking at the garden and upon Appleton House. So examples where the tree of life informs particular arboreal imagery in these texts. And then I also have a chapter on Amelia Lanier, who was the first published female poet, looking at her country house poem, The Description of Cookham, where she has a key episode, a kind of a mystical experience beneath a tree on the country estate. So I look at that in terms of the whole tree history of the tree of life, etc. Yeah, so that's kind of really interesting, because there has been a lot on Lanya, but there wasn't much looking at the actual tree. So that was a really interesting part of the project. And then I kind of look at sort of aspects like the iconography and the ideology of pruning and reform and grafting, and how that emerges as well in this literature. So there's this whole interesting network of ideas that surrounded trees. Like it's actually huge. So actually cutting it down was the big challenge. And my original manuscript was 120,000 words, and Routledge said, no, it's got to be 100,000. So cutting 20,000 words was a bit of an exercise. Yeah, I just thought I'd show you this. This is a sketch from Leonardo da Vinci's notebook, illustrating the idea of severance and then regeneration, which is a key idea in this iconography. And here is the base of Michelangelo's statue, which has the same idea, the severed tree. So yeah, so the chapter on the iconography explores all these sorts of ideas. And then the final chapter in the book is looking at a less well-known text by Ralph Austin, which is really interesting because it's a horticultural text. So it's telling people to plant fruit trees, and yet it's still imbued with much of the tree of life ideology. And it's a really interesting text because it's kind of on that fulcrum between kind of the earlier symbolic ways of looking at things and this new kind of proto-scientific attitude to nature, which emerges with the Royal Society, etc. And he was part of the Samuel Hartlib circle, etc. So yeah, so that's the last chapter of the book, examining ideas in a different context. So yeah, it's basically the book as a whole is kind of looking at intersections between the symbolic and the naturalistic, and the ways in which writers imbued with all this ideology then projected it onto landscapes, whether it was forests or country estates, and they viewed nature in these interesting ways that were informed by this network of intertexts. So yeah, so that's pretty much what I wanted to say there. Yeah, so how's that for timing? Is that okay, Ruby? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so I'm super excited about it, and there's been a lot of interest in it, which I'm really thrilled about. So a lot of people have kind of known this project at different stages. Yeah, so that's probably all from me at the moment.
Thank you so much. Claire, did you want to pick up on your one first?
Yes, sure. I'll just share my screen, and hopefully that works all right. Can you all see that okay? Beautiful. All right. I'm going to try very hard to keep to 7 minutes. So my paper today is drawn from an article I'm working on as part of a Blue Humanities special issue, and that's emerging out of work being done at my university's Blue Humanities Lab, which is an interdisciplinary initiative centered on the blue spaces of our world. So today I want to focus on 3 blue spaces that we see in Shakespeare and also in our own encounters with the blue, and they are coral reefs, seafloor or seabeds, and shipwreck. I'm going to be looking at examples of these spaces, which of course overlap in 2 plays, The Tempest and Richard III, very briefly. So these spaces, of course, belong not just in the plays, but they're also places in which we can temporarily immerse ourselves. Off the coast of Townsville, where my campus is based, lie coral reefs, seafloors accessible when the tide is right, and many shipwrecks and plane wrecks. In exploring these blue literary and real places, what I'm interested in understanding is what Bertrand Westphal has called the relation between reality and fiction, between the spaces of the world and the spaces in the text. So how might the blue spaces of the plays and our lived experience of blue be entangled? In exploring this interstitial space between lived and literary, geographies of the real and imaginary, experienced and fictional place, this work subscribes to a geocritical imperative that all places combine the real and the imaginary. The interaction of Shakespeare's blue sights of reef, ocean floors, and shipwreck with our own material, historical, and imagined experience of the same sites can generate the emergence of a concept called spatial imaginaries, which is not my own term. This concept refers to shared ideas about spaces and places produced by stories and embodied performance in the material world. So it's a social and collective process of imagining place that interweaves story and sight, narrative and space to produce and develop conceptualizations of specific places over time. So based on this, it's possible to co-locate our own experience of blue spaces, the three in particular that I'm looking at today, with Shakespeare's through this idea of shared spatial imaginaries. So with that kind of in mind, what I want to do now is turn to my first blue space, and that is coral on the seabed. In The Tempest, Prince Ferdinand is led to believe his father is drowned, and the spirit Ariel's song, which you can see here, describes the transformation of his father's body in quite a famous passage. So the body of the king, sunk to the ocean floor, becomes neither fish food nor gruesome corpse, but rather is sea changed into an oceanic form of coral made. Shakespeare offers a more complex depiction here of human oceanic relations. One does not destroy the other, but rather coral and human form become entangled. Oceanic place is therefore a kind of an agent enacting transformation upon the human body. And that is quite the reversal of human-ocean relations that we're used to. In this imagined entanglement, Shakespeare offers up a model for interactions that might differ from our dominant models. Human output in the Anthropocene is indeed entangled with coral, as we all know, but to deleterious effect. A recent study, for example, tells us that there is a low likelihood that coral reefs will maintain their functional roles without near-term stabilization of atmospheric CO2 emissions. Basically, rising sea levels will start to prevent the vertical accretion of coral, so they won't be able to match that sea level rise. So while in our public sphere, that tends to be the discourse, the focus on the human impacts on the reef, Shakespeare's depiction of this encounter offers a slightly different viewpoint. It's the sea acting on the human, generating change. The most striking aspect of this collision of real and imagined reef space is that link between bone and coral. Ariel sings of his bones are coral made. And the image of coral as bone is reminiscent of coral reefs blanched bone white in mass coral bleaching events. In the Great Barrier Reef and globally, high sea surface temperatures trigger these events in which coral polyps expel the colorful tiny algae that live inside them, and that's what provides them with color and with energy. And this gives that pale or bleached appearance. If the water remains too warm, the algae die off, and then we get what's called a white skeleton. So while bone turns to coral in The Tempest, in our reef, coral is turning to bone. So our climate grief for anthropogenic change inflicted upon corals can be paralleled to Ferdinand's grief for his father's bone coral transformation. Ferdinand describes himself as stained with grief by the loss of his father. This image of bone coral transformation manifests or perhaps just exemplifies a shared spatial imaginary of human interactions with coral reefs. But in raising that imaginary, this collective understanding of the reef over time, The Tempest invites a challenge to the organization of relationships within that imaginary. It offers a reimagining of human-ocean relations in which the agency of the blue is emphasized. Now, I want now to move on, going okay for time, move on to Richard III. Which is quite a different take on the blue. So the sea in Shakespeare's King Richard III kind of bookends the play in a way. We open with the image of the deep bosom of the ocean burying the clouds upon the House of York. And then in Act 4, we get the ocean transporting the threat to Richard's reign. His enemy, Richmond, is on the seas. Richard is warned. And Richard retorts, "There let him sink and be the seas on him." One of Richard's early victims, his brother Clarence, dreams of his own body lost at the bottom of the ocean. I'm not going to go over that. I'm not going to read that, but do feel free to skim it as I'm chatting. Steve Mentz has described this vision of submarine opulence as using objects of desire as tokens of fearful mortality. The sea, he adds, is simultaneously wealth and death in an echo of early modern patterns of maritime symbology. The sea is highway to commercial prosperity and a vision of God's torment. And while Clarence's dream does, as Mentz writes, bring poetry to the inaccessible sea floor, in a presentist light, it also raises the spectre of large-scale human pollution. This discarded litter of humanity is starkly evident here. Thousands of shipwrecks, anchors, and precious metals are beautifully, poetically reminiscent of our own uglier oceanic pollution. And another point I wanted to make on this is that Clarence has granted an unusual post-mortem view of the ocean floor here, a view that confirms the visions of a dominant spatial imaginary shared across centuries, the seafloor as unseen, unreachable, a terrifying depth encompassing the unknown, where the human is subsumed within an agential, more than human world. Susanna Crockford's identification of 4 cultural narratives of the ocean applies here, especially her narrative of governing the abyss. This exemplifies what Serpil Opperman has called stories inbuilt in the seawater, a phrase I really love, which to me sort of suggests this dominant spatial imaginary that sees the ocean floor as unknown, terrifying, dangerous. And this affects how we understand the ocean floor as real and imagined place, to come back to that concept I started with. The ocean floor exemplifies the potential for shifting or uneven dominance of real or imagined elements. Here, I think, and perhaps for us more generally, the imagined tends to be dominant over our experience of the real. Literary and dramatic representation may be more familiar than our own experience. So to conclude, I just wanted to kind of point out that both of these examples are actually imagined. Ariel's song is a supernatural trick. Clarence's shipwreck and ocean floor is just a dream. There are no literal transformations of human oceanic relations here. Even within the play worlds, there's an entanglement of real and imagined place. So in adopting this concept of spatial imaginaries, I'm hoping to develop my awareness of the rich, complex, and mutually informing relationship between what we understand to be real, lived, experienced place, dramatic and literary place, and our individual and collective imaginaries of the blue, which incorporate and entangle both of the former. I will leave it there. Thank you. And I'll try and stop sharing as well. There we go.
Thank you so much. That was such a tour de force.
Sorry, I know I was trying to condense the paper in just 7 minutes. I hope I wasn't too far over.
Absolutely fine. Killian, we have you next.
Great, thanks a lot. Hope you can hear me okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Before saying anything else, I do want to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Fitzroy, Victoria, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. I also want to say thanks to Liam for the provocation, to my fellow presenters for their work, and to everyone who's dialing in. So Bev Sherry's paper opens by reminding us that Paradise Lost is not least of all a poem about mining. And to situate the very few marks I want to make today, I'd also like to begin by directing our attention to an extractive zone, albeit a submarine as opposed to subterranean one. I'm thinking of what Will Hilton calls the global seafloor, a figure reckoned by some to hold, quote, more valuable minerals than all the continents combined. Mostly defined as being located in international waters, the sea bottom is generating multiple and multiplying forms of what Elizabeth Colbert calls Anthropocene irony. As an object for natural resource frontierism, its exploitation would appear to portend a new and even more appalling phase in anthropogenic destruction of planetary ecosystems. As a repository of such polymetallic nodules as, prospective miners tell us, are required for the battery storage our societies will need, its riches are touted as an answer to the harms of land-based mining. So here comes the leap. For the research that became my second book manuscript, The Vast Unseen Mansions of the Deep, I began by asking what happens if we examine the history of British poetics in the long 18th century from underwater. What I didn't really anticipate at first was the extent to which the book would become a study of marine and submarine value, and of the way the idea of that value would move from sites and reports of salvage diving to the collection and display of encrusted subaqueous curiosities to a poetics of submergence, whereby a literary gesture is justified in terms of its having achieved unprecedented imaginative access to the undersea. I didn't understand, moreover, the degree to which this movement would become an object of critical vexation, whether because it seemed to participate in what Daniel Defoe called the projecting humor of the age, or because it stretched the capacities of poetic genre so far as to risk travestying them. In other words, I hadn't expected to encounter among 17th, 18th, and early 19th century poems a record of something like, which is not to say identical to, the intense, ambivalent energies that attend contemporary attempts to bring the ocean to awareness, experience, and knowledge. From an historiographical point of view, one of the reasons I think this matters is that it slightly disorients one consensus idea of marine cultural history in the West. The idea I'm referring to is one that observes European regard for the undersea becoming recognizably, quote, modern around the middle of the 19th century in the course of a variety of infrastructural, technological, and scientific advances. There's a lot to recommend that account, but as James Del Borgo, Natasha Adamowski, and others have reminded us, it also has some problems because it tends to overlook longer and messier trajectories in sub-oceanity that aren't necessarily pre-modern, simply because we no longer think of them as constituting our present-day techno-ocean, let alone our present-day ways of being at sea. And such trajectories are plentiful, but the one I'll stress here, because it's so pertinent for seabed mining and the Anthropocene, is early modern diving, an extraordinarily complicated realm of skill, finance, and discourse that we are just beginning to understand, but that very frequently involved the unfree labors of Black, Brown, and Indigenous persons engaged in projects carried out by burgeoning imperial powers in competition for drowned value. So I try in my book not only to re-examine well-known tropologies of submerged riches, such as some of those that we just heard about, with these histories in mind, but to ponder the poetics of diving and drowning more broadly. A going underwater generates distinctive vectors in and of poetic space, ones that can tell us a lot about how writers comprehended the particular figurative affordances of seagoing in an era that Alain Corbin identified some decades ago now as a transitional epoch in marinal epistemology. And those affordances are ones that 21st century scholars might, I think, do well to contemplate as they embark on recent and future oceanic turns. For the blue humanities, ocean studies, thalassography, and so forth, the swimmer and the diver have become figures of not just scholarly interest, but scholarly identification, not least of all for the person addressing you right now. And early modern literatures have the potential, I think, to reacquaint us with some of immersion's more difficult, indeed more unsettling aspects, as well as to disrupt some resilient teleologies in oceanic understanding. And beyond critique, these encounters might help cultivate in us a sense of salubrious ambivalence for our claims to be going under, as well as to be staying well ashore. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We have a bit of time for questions, and I know that Victoria has to head off early for teaching. So I thought I would start and ask you something, first of all, Victoria, while everyone sort of has a moment to sort of gather their thoughts. You talk a little bit about severance and regeneration as a theme with trees, and I also really enjoyed you saying you had to cut down the manuscript on trees. That little bit of mental imagery was quite appropriate. Yeah. And I sort of thought it interacted quite interestingly with something that Claire mentioned, which was that we have the humans act quite deleteriously on the sea, but then in early modern drama and poetry, we see the sea acting on humans. I was wondering if you had come across anything like that in your work on trees, whether or not you saw trees acting on humans in certain ways.
Yes, well, I mean, overall, there's this kind of like, it seemed to me that there was this kind of blurring. And at the beginning, you kind of get these kind of emblematic sort of uses of trees. And then it becomes, writers thinking of themselves as arboreal. So even like, when you look at some of the poetry of Herbert and Vaughan, they will be working through their kind of spiritual states and think of themselves in arboreal terms as such. So yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, throughout there's this kind of constant like blurring and flipping. And I was thinking that was a nice connection with Claire's kind of idea where you're kind of getting this these spaces where you have the intersection of the kind of imaginary and the, you know, the realistic, etc. And that's something certainly I was seeing with trees as well. Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Did we have, sorry, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Did we have any other questions? I don't want to take up too much oxygen.
May I ask one, Ruby? This is, yeah, thanks again to co-presenters. My first question is for Victoria as well. And it may be the kind of question that simply points in a direction that this book didn't want to go. So in which case, cool. But I was thinking, what about trees of death as well as trees of life? I mean, what comes to mind most readily is I'm sorry to be so kind of like grim, but what comes to mind is the way that trees are things that people can hang other people from, for example, or hang animals from. And I was thinking, for example, of Tyburn, both as an actual tree used for public executions, and then eventually, you know, a scaffold that was still called a tree that had retained some element of its treeness. And so I just wonder, like, is there space in your project for, you know, trees pointing in a somewhat more maleficent direction than toward more life?
Yeah, absolutely. Killian, good question. And your book sounds amazing. Can't wait to read it.
Likewise.
Yeah,
likewise.
Absolutely. Like the whole thing about the tree of life is it's this dual paradigm. And I'm just going to quickly share my screen to show you an idea. Can you guys see that? Can you see the Mappa Mundi?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, definitely. So the trees of death are actually a really important part and integrated with the whole tree of life idea. So I'm showing you the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which many of you will be familiar with. And then if I can show you, so, you know, as you know, it's the TO map. And then if we go right to the top, for example, so can you see that? This is the Garden of Eden, yeah. So if you look to the right, you'll see the arbor sicca. So this is the dry tree. So there's all this kind of interesting interlinked. The idea is that the tree of knowledge, once the fall takes place, it becomes the dry tree, and there's a whole body of medieval folklore, etc. And you can see that the artist who has created the map here has kind of literalized this idea. So the tree of knowledge, once it's kind of outside, you get this kind of idea of wilderness. You know, the dry tree, the dead tree becomes this symbol that encapsulates the whole state of mankind. And I'll just show you a couple of other quick images. Right, next slide. So here, say, for example, in this Schongauer etching, you've got the dry tree in the back. So there's all this interesting iconography. So this is a foreshadowing of the death of Christ, but it's all kind of encapsulated with the idea of the fall. And it also intersects with the idea of the crucifixion. And interestingly, the whole paradigm of trees of death and life it becomes this idea of like this paradigm of actual spaces. So here, say, for example, in Bellini's Madonna of the Meadow, you can't really see it in a reproduction, but when you get to see the original, which is in the National Gallery in London, this sphere, which is kind of the enclosed garden and Eden, etc., this is all detailed greenery. So this is kind of leaves, etc. But once you get into the fallen space of wilderness, the space of mankind, the space of the dry tree, you get dry pebbles. So the whole paradigm of the dead tree, flourishing tree, extends into kind of ideas of wilderness, space, etc. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's all really fascinating. And then you've got the Piero della Francesca series, where you've got this whole story of the iconography of trees. Here you've got, say, a depiction of the death of Adam. So the idea is that, you know, Seth goes back to Eden and gets the seeds from the garden, and they're planted in the mouth of the dying Adam. And then that grows the tree, which eventually becomes the cross. So there's all this fascinating, iconography. But yeah, really good question, and absolutely dead trees of death are actually all a part of it. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Did we have any other questions? Yes, please, Natalie.
Hi, I'm a bit of a latecomer to this seminar. Thanks, Liam, for extending the invitation to me. I really enjoyed those papers. My research is about shipwrecks, so I particularly loved Claire and Killian's. Claire, I was really struck by your drawing attention to the bones and the corals there. They strike me as shiny white objects, right? Kind of hard and the sort of thing you might notice under the water. I just wanted to mention quite a few of the other objects that are found on shipwreck assemblages are things like, I'm aware of one shipwreck where they found a polished molar, someone's tooth, elephant tusks. There's another shipwreck where they've identified tiger bones. So it just strikes me that these things that are surviving underwater for such a long time, they're the hard things. And I really loved the way you drew attention to how the ocean is acting on those objects, really decentering. You know, we think about trade and these vessels moving across the ocean, knowledge and ideas and all that sort of thing. But once they're wrecked, the ocean sort of has its own agenda. And there's something about these shiny white surfaces that's really striking me today. I don't know why, but I just wanted to throw some more shiny white surfaces in there. Thank you. I really enjoyed your paper.
Thank you. I did not know that, especially about the tiger bones, but you're right. There is something quite, I guess, antithetical about those two in the very fluid space to have hard and movable objects and surfaces. So I would love to hear more about your research. It sounds fascinating.
Thank you. I'm very inspired by Killian's work. Killian, when he was still in Sydney, came into my office before he left and just threw some words down. Actually, we had a lovely conversation. I threw some words down afterwards, and this post-it note has been on my desk ever since. It says multi-species wrecks. And it's something that I'm really inspired by and trying to do more thinking with at the moment about wrecks. Liam's heard all this like earlier this morning, but wrecks as reefs, and the in-between period between when a ship goes down.
That's all right, they can't hear us.
When it's recovered, what happens in that in-between period, what processes, and the wreck is becoming, you know, this multi-species process. So
as it becomes something for the more than human species under, yeah, brilliant. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to reading more of your work, and Killian, super excited to hear a bit more about your book manuscript. Congratulations on that. And Victoria, also really enjoyed your arboreal focus as well. What a delightful surprise. So thank you. I hope I haven't taken up too much time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was so lovely. Hugh, I can see you have your hand up. Did you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ruby. Thanks, everybody. This is a bit of a dumbass question, and I feel awkward asking it after Natalie talking about the white things, because it was a question about colour, and I guess particularly aimed at Claire, but thinking perhaps more broadly about the uses of colour in early modern conceptions of the world. Because for me, that thing into the Tempest has always been kind of weird, because coral for Shakespeare would always be understood as red rather than white. So coral is a red colour, so the thing from the sonnets, isn't it? So coral is far more red than my and he only ever uses coral to mean bright red in connection with lips, particularly, and that's because it came from the Red Sea. So people had these kind of weird kind of metonymic associations between color, the sea, and red, and we're using red coral as a jewelry as well. So it's being next to white, the white of the pearls, is the use of these things, these objects, as quite kind of common forms of jewelry. So people would wear red bits of coral around their neck and things like that. And I was just thinking about whether the idea of the blue is good enough for thinking about a Shakespearean ocean, because really he often thinks about it in terms of redness and greenness more than anything. And then even when he uses the word blue, it's often to mean blood. So like veins in people's faces are called blue, like in Lucrece and so on. So I'm just wondering about how helpful blue is as a concept for you when we're thinking about the multicolored version of the ocean that Shakespeare gives us, and thinking about Macbeth in particular, where he calls it the green one that's turning red.
Yes.
And in The Tempest, we've got an ocean which turns white things into red things, weirdly. So bones get turned into something that's bright red. It's all kind of, yeah, that's it.
No, I think it's a really good point. It's actually a topic that has come up quite a bit in our Blue Humanities Lab at JCU, because we have a range of different scholars working on what we're calling the blue humanities, but we have had debates about this. So for example, waters in North Queensland are usually often not blue, they're muddy, they're brown. So yeah, for my historian colleagues in this lab, blue isn't really appropriate. And we also have an anthropologist working in the group who works with the Yungal people in Northern Australia and has been doing so for about 20 years. And from that perspective, blue doesn't really cut it either. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm also working with a scholar in the US who wants to talk about white ecologies in terms of snow, which is important in, say, Montana. I think there's work to be done on how we articulate the blue humanities and what that actually means. I think blue is kind of probably a bit of a lazy kind of catch-all at the moment, because you're right, these spaces, the ones I'm talking about today, certainly not just blue or blue at all. And when you're talking about other disciplines as well, you need to factor in a range of different perspectives. So yeah, this is a kind of an ongoing question that I haven't resolved, our lab certainly hasn't resolved, but it's something that we're trying to be aware of as we go forward. And your point about coral, it's something I've been mulling over a lot as well. That this use of coral doesn't seem to match the other references in Shakespeare's works. It stands apart. And I find that really interesting. I don't have an answer for it, but this is definitely something that we need to do more work on. So thank you so much, Hugh.
No, that's great. And because for me, it would be kind of interesting. I don't think that Shakespeare, if we thought about how Shakespeare thought about the ocean, I can't imagine that he would think it was blue. Like he doesn't ever say that. So it's kind of, so it might be a real help there, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Brett. We'll go Liam and then Victoria, and then we might move on to the second lot of papers, and we can revisit questions about the three we've already heard later if the sort of connections come up. But Liam, did you want to go now?
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks, this is just so fascinating. And that inquiry into the name of this emergent discipline, as it were, is just so fantastic. Right at the leading edge of things to kind of think about the way names signify. And I think perhaps even after Black Lives Matter, this sort of thing is even more resonant and really fascinating. But actually, Killian, I'm thinking about what you presented. I had two quick thoughts. One was, do you deal with the Thames? And maybe we're back to water that doesn't have a good colour. I'm just wondering about, the undersea. You're out in the ocean, so I'm not sure if you're thinking about the Thames and what people might be doing in the Thames underwater in that period that you're looking at. But my other question was, is there an undersea poetic form?
Yeah, that's great. Two great questions. Thanks a lot, Liam. So to your first question about the Thames, the answer is definitely yes, at least a couple of ways. So one of the things that I write about is the relationship between a kind of craze for diving engines at the end of the 17th century and the ways this is taken up in poetic and critical literatures in the early 18th century. A lot of that is happening in the Thames. So the Thames is a kind of an experimental space for going underwater, for better and for worse, I think. And the forms of kind of enthusiasm, but also critical opprobrium that become attached to that sort of thing are, I think, actually really, really interesting in ways that maybe are very obliquely but meaningfully relevant for what we're talking about around submarines right at the moment, and their kind of underhandedness and so on. Also, thinking of the Thames, I think you can't write about sort of fishing and fishers without thinking about estuaries and thinking about rivers and thinking about the ways in which estuaries and rivers bring sea matter into metropolitan spaces. And so one chapter of the book is about a kind of problematics of fishing and the fisher in 18th century poetics. And that's, among other things, about estuarine spaces and about a kind of perceived violation of the urban by the oceanic. I'm so sorry, Liam. Tell me the second part of your question, because I had something to say about it.
Oh, it was simply, is there an undersea poetic form?
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I think that the undersea's formal provocations are many and move in lots of directions. I mean, some of the things that it does to disrupt poetic form are perhaps as interesting as anything else. But just to answer your question briefly, in an 18th century context, I'm really interested in the way that the Pindaric seems to be really useful for thinking oceanically and sub-oceanically through pieces like Thomas Herrick's The Submarine Voyage from the late 17th century, through which, Pindaric poetics becomes a kind of vehicle, right, for doing the world ocean in a very kind of like Thomas Burnett traveling through the center of the earth way, but in a way that I think is not irrelevant for the figure of the world ocean, which a number of scholars argue emerges as a kind of object for thought around the middle of the 17th century. Stepping out of the 18th century just for a second, to turn to the work that I've spent more time talking with Natalie about, for example, I'm really interested contemporarily in a kind of in the kind of cachet that Recce and other seabed curiosities are acquiring in museum spaces and elsewhere. And one of the things that most interests me about those contexts are the ways in which the kind of stuff and the agency of things like encrusted porcelain are articulated in museum catalogs, in art historical and curatorial scholarship, etc. And so often it seems to me a poetics of a kind of exuberant poetics of a kind of list of matters and agencies and times and provenances emerges from some of these objects in a way that is not at all 18th century, but that I think is a kind of oceanic form, to borrow from a phrase that Claire used earlier on.
Oh, great, thanks. Cornucopia, some sort of undersea cornucopia.
That's nice, yeah, cool.
Victoria, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, look, I have to run off and teach now, but just before I go, I just wanted to say, for Claire and Killian and anyone else interested in shipwrecks, when the borders come down, if at some stage you get to Belfast, the University of Belfast has some amazing coins that were recovered from the Spanish Armada wrecks. And they're so bright. They look like they've been minted yesterday. So, that would be interesting for thinking about like colors or metal. And the other thing they dug up were kind of like their little heraldic badges, etc. And that's a way they've been able to work out who was on what particular ships and what their kind of class status was. So that's another whole thing about, class remnants of these shipwreck assemblages. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone. Never have I been more reluctant to leave a Zoom meeting, but I will see you all later. Bye.
Thanks, Victoria.
Thanks,
Thank
Victoria.
you so much. I actually feel like that's probably quite a good place to maybe move on to our second group of speakers, and then we can do another Q&A section at the end. So we now have John Severn from Macquarie, who's going to be talking about operatic engagements with the natural world and Merry Wives of Windsor, and Liam from University of Sydney, who's going to be talking about the new unit of study, SLAM 403, meaning in the Anthropocene. I know I've already introduced them, but I thought it was probably worth doing it again. John, did you want to start us off?
Yes, thanks, Ruby. So in this presentation, I show how two operatic adaptations of the Merry Wives of Windsor preceded modern eco-criticism on the play. Falstaff, a 1799 Viennese opera with music by Antonio Salieri and a libretto by Carlo Prospero di Franceschi, and Die Lustigen Weiber from Windsor, an 1849 Berlin opera with music by Otto Nicolai and a libretto by Salman Hermann von Mosenthal, both expand upon Shakespeare in their treatment of the natural world to present Windsors that are more than the sum of their human inhabitants. Salieri's Falstaff focuses on jealousy, characterized as a lack of rationality, and represented by the hyper-emotional Mr. Ford. The final scene takes place in Windsor Forest, represented by woodland scenery. And in terms of 18th century Viennese opera buffa scenic convention, Salieri's Falstaff is unusual in representing Windsor Forest as a forest. Outdoor scenes in these operas usually displayed signs of human habitation, even if they were meant to be in the wild. It's in this unpopulated context that the rational Mr. Slender, who's Shakespeare's master page, waits alone for his friends and sings of his rational confidence in his wife. Here the forest itself enriches the aria's meaning. Mr. Slender is not only surrounded by nature, but nature confirms the sentiments in his aria. An echo, sung by an offstage baritone, affirms the last phrase of each stanza. As Slender says of his rational approach to life, the echo itself confirms it, and on such a point, anyone with any sense can echo me. In Shakespeare's Forest, verse replaces the prose of the bulk of the play. Salieri's Forest likewise transforms the opera's musical texture. The spare accompaniment to Mr. Slender's aria, largely restricted to basso continuo with occasional woodwind ornamentation, contrasts strongly with the rich orchestration of Mr. Ford's earlier emotional arias in the town. At the same time, the simplified accompaniment reinforces both the naturalness of the forest context and the apparently natural wisdom of the aria's content. The accompaniment will be stripped back even further to a solo cello and solo violin in the Ford's subsequent duet of Reconciliation in the Forest. Whereas Shakespeare's forest setting suggests the natural rightness of the existing human order and Mistress Quickly's praise of her radiant queen, Windsor Castle, and the Order of the Garter, in Mr. Slender's aria, Salieri and De Franceschi develop Shakespeare's Windsor Forest into a quasi-character who affirms and celebrates the apparently natural order of trust between spouses. In the absence of the distracting orchestral accompaniment of Mr. Ford's irrational, jealous rages, the rational Mr. Slender can both hear nature's voice and himself become part of the natural order in the call and response of the echo. If Shakespeare's Forest celebrates what is, Mr. Slender and Salieri's Forest together suggest what should be, what could be, but at this stage of the opera for the Fords, what is not yet. Like Salieri's Falstaff, Windsor Forest and Nicolai de Lustigen Weiber from Windsor is more than a backdrop for human activity. In contrast to Salieri's stripped-back forest orchestration, Nicolai manipulates instrumentation to suggest a forest throbbing with vibrant non-human life. Whereas the standard four-part orchestral string writing of first and second violins, violas, and combined cellos and basses acts as a neutral ensemble sound throughout the town scenes, in the forest, Nicolai creates shimmering invocations of insect life as phenomenal sound by dividing the strings and varying their registration. So we have the first violins muted and split into four separate lines, playing trills at the extreme high end of the violin range. Unmuted second violins playing double stop pizzicato, violas and cellos are bowed and unmuted, and the double basses play pizzicato. And this results in a 9-part string harmony with highly unusual textures and an extremely wide range, which gives a really excellent effect of insects. Humans are not the only life, therefore, in Nikolai's forest. Most remarkable is the forest scene's opening. For almost 5 minutes, the stage is empty of humans. As the moon slowly rises, the focus of the stage is the forest and its relationship to the cosmic, rather than to human action. Musically, the scene begins pianissimo. Individual instruments enter with variations on the same slow phrase, giving a sense of separate but related life forms awakening, as the orchestral texture and colour become richer and more vibrant over a long crescendo. As the full orchestra plays, disembodied offstage voices join it in a song to the moon. The forest itself is singing. Victor Hugo's discussion of the role of scenery in his 1827 preface to Cromwell was a strong influence on 19th century Romantic opera. And I quote from Hugo, "People are beginning to understand in our day that exact localization is one of the first elements of reality. The speaking or acting characters are not the only ones who engrave on the minds of the spectators a faithful representation of the facts. The place where this or that catastrophe took place becomes a terrible and inseparable witness thereof. And the absence of silent characters of this sort would make the greatest scenes of history incomplete in the drama." In this forest scene, Nikolai goes far beyond this. His forest is neither silent nor primarily a witness to human action. It's a complex life force with business of its own to conduct, and a relationship with the universe that sidelines the human. That the voices sing to the moon in block chords while the orchestra continues to play with the melodic phrase is also a musical argument for the inconsequentiality in cosmic terms of human concerns. Nikolai's music was attacked by nationalist German critics for his Italianate influences. And the opera as a whole stages a dialectic between German music, in which, roughly speaking, orchestral harmony is given priority, and Italian music, here especially represented by Windsor's younger generation, in which vocal melody is given priority. As the forest voices provide the block chord harmony, while the orchestra provides the melody, the forest throws human national aesthetic arguments on their head. While Shakespeare's Windsor Forest prompts homage to Queen Elizabeth and the existing political order, Salieri's forest voices a natural order from which some human characters have deviated, but to which they might return, and which they will be able to hear if they do return. Nikolai's forest, on the other hand, is a vibrant life force, independent of humans, part of a natural order that extends beyond the Earth to encompass its place in the solar system.
Wow, that's terrific, John. Thanks, thanks so much. I'm now Ruby, in case people haven't got that transition there. Ruby had to run off and teach, but yeah, thanks so much, John. And I have the pleasure now of moving us along swiftly to my own paper. So I will commence at this point by sharing my screen. Actually, I'll rig my screen first, and then I'll share my screen. Okay. I hope that's visible to all. Terrific. So all I want to do is just show you a little bit about what I've been teaching this semester, which is a brand new unit of study. So this will give a kind of pedagogical angle to some of the things we're talking about. The institutional context is that the University of Sydney created a 4th year for our undergraduates that was not the regular honours year. And they were envisioning students who would go into 4th year having completed a major in the bachelor's degree, and they would be students who wouldn't necessarily be thinking about a research degree or honours, but ways that they could connect their study to the world. And that was called the Bachelor of Advanced Studies. And it's a single year. It's effectively half a year's study. And within the Bachelor of Advanced Studies at the University of Sydney, then they sought units of study to populate that, units of study that would connect the arts and humanities, in our case, to the world. And so the course that I'm teaching fits into that context, and it is called Meaning in the Anthropocene, or Anthropocene. And I thought I'd give you a quick kind of look at the way it's set up. So the first part of the course is about getting or losing our bearings, and it's emphasizing very much a transition from older understandings, kind of pre-planetary understandings of where the human fits, and then shifting into a more planetary concept. So you can see there, these are just screenshots from the Canvas LMS that we use. The first section you'll see there is a whole range of theories that people can dip into to think with, mainly through video resourcing there. And that list obviously is endless, but that's just a selection. But then, then in week 1 down the bottom here, we talk about the humanities and explore what the humanities are and what they might offer. So the starting point is thinking about what the humanities give and to get students to think about the humanities. And then after that, in week 2, it's an introduction of The Tempest. So it's solely looking at The Tempest as a play, as an artwork, and getting to know The Tempest as a play. But then after that, week 3, we're onto the science of how the Earth is being altered by human impact. And so week 3, each student had to come back and actually present their being across one of these topics. And that was great because the students only had to get across one topic. The material's everywhere to find online, and then they had to share their knowledge of one of these topics that are listed here, and also to think about what might be a concrete example of it. And so that was a very fruitful discussion about the altered Earth. And still in this part 1 of the course, then we moved on to environmental justice or climate justice. And once again, The Tempest started to feature then as something to think about. And I'll come back to The Tempest. And then in week 5, onto multi-species justice, more than human agency. Week 6, onto Indigenous knowledge, and I'll come back to that too. Week 7, we've just had, which was a virtual visit to the University Museum. And the second half of the course, part 2, getting disciplinary and institutional traction, that is actually the section we're about to enter. So we haven't taught this yet, and you'll see it's got colleagues from different disciplines, Anne Elias from art history, and then Mark Byron, who's with us here. I think I've lost my screen at the moment. Looking at Beckett's Endgame from literature point of view, Jay Johnson from Studies in Religion, talking about rewilding, and then we've got digital cultures talking about AI and how the Internet of Things, that the digital has a material footprint, basically. And then finally, performance, theatre and performance studies, and the Sydney Environment Institute at the end. So the course, if you think about it, at the beginning, it's kind of theoretical and also science connected. And then in the second half, it's getting discipline experts to help students think about how disciplines get traction or get meaning by interacting with the notion of the Anthropocene. So that's how the course works. I'll just pick up on a couple of other points. Here's one. The Tempest, I've positioned The Tempest as what I call a provocation and a clue. And the idea is that it provokes, because The Tempest as a play raises so many great questions that connect with the Anthropocene, including, colonialism and empire and indigeneity and so many issues. So it's a provocation, but it's also a clue in the sense that it can point us to ideas, point us or lead us through ideas. And I emphasize at the end, it's not an answer. The Tempest is not an answer, but it's presented to students as a play one could come back to be provoked by, and also to get clues from in the form of directions or just ideas. And some of those ideas you can see on the right there, this notion that the Tempest, you can think of the Tempest as a fact almost, in the sense that it's representing these connections with fresh islands to be encountered by empire, by European empire. And so it's kind of occurring, the story of the tempest is occurring at the same time as the colonization process is occurring in a similar way. And so it's reflective of fact in certain ways. Looking at justice and ethics, using speeches from the tempest to get students to discuss characters' perspectives. So what is Prospero's perspective on the island? Or what is Prospero's perspective on what's meaningful in life? Or what is the perspective of, say, Caliban or Ariel? And multi-species justice, thinking about the being of, say, the island, or the being of Ariel, who is another species. Caliban's more problematic because he's not another species. He's human, but turned into a monster through the language and description of the play, and his mother is seemingly a witch. I mentioned there at the bottom there 2 readings that we use in the course, Jason Moore's work on cheap nature and Joan Martinez Allier's work on environmentalism of the poor. And the reason for doing so is that cheap nature gives actually a theorization of capitalism and the Capitalocene. And that's really handy for thinking about how capitalism works and how nature and the poor suffer as a result. And Martinez Allier is brilliant for highlighting the vocabulary of grassroots activism and resistance and impact in poorer parts of the world. Not the academic vocabulary, the vocabulary that rises from those who are impacted by capitalism. So these 2 writers give us an opposite kind of angles on the same topic. Now, one way to sum up kind of the difference here might be in these 2 images. On the left, it's that first known picture of the tempest, which really is the shipwreck at the beginning. But you can see standing there on the left is Prospero, organizing it all, using his magic to orchestrate the supernatural wreck of the ship. And so there's Prospero manipulating nature and the other species through Ariel, etc. But on the right is a painting that Peter Minter talked about within the course in the lesson on Indigenous art. And it's a type of unlandscape painting. So it's a brilliant piece of work which shows another way of doing landscape painting where it looks, where it's organic, it's about life, it's about water. It's very much an Indigenous representation of Minamata country in Tasmania. And it's about life. It's not about nature being external and to be manipulated, like the picture on the left. It's about all of us being part of nature, all of us being alive in that way. Finally, I'll give you a quick little tour, if this works, and then I'll finish up, of Ariel's Island, which I built rather crazily and invited my students to join. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'll pull you into another one right now to show you. Here we go. Okay, can you see that? This is in Kumo space. I don't know if anyone has used it, but it's a meeting platform. So it's like a fun form of Zoom. And you'll see there LS. I have my camera off. Here I am. And I can move around. And I built this island as a space to use as a classroom. So I can move around the island. If I go near the water, you should be able to hear the waves. And if I go over here, I had the discourse donut as a place where all the students would have their own little box. All our faces are in these boxes and you can all hang around here. And if you're within the circle here, the proximity circle, you can hear each other. And so we could have a conversation there. And then we could break up for, and you can see on these signs, this is terminology from Jason Moore about the Capitalocene that we could discuss. And then I could break them into groups where one group would go over here to Caliban's cave cooler. He doesn't have many resources and they can talk about the environmentalism of the poor there. No one can hear them. It's a breakout group because the sound doesn't go beyond the perimeter. And then the other group got to go up here to Prospero's Dutchy Diner, which has all the modern trappings of capitalism, including a coffee machine, and they could have a discussion there. And there's a few other features here, including a link through to YouTube, where they can actually watch that full screen and see YouTube clips. So I will now get us out of here, and I'll stop sharing. But that was one class where we discussed the ethics relating to the tempest. And let me just take you to my final slide. Whoops, sorry. Oh, I lost my. Oh, there we are. Sorry about that. I just wanted to show you in the final slide here, you can see how I gave myself a stupid name, Master Pignut, because of the way Caliban likes pig nuts. And I invited the students to do the same. And here they are all clustered round when we're talking. I've blacked out their identity, but you can see they gave themselves fun names, and we got to talk about the tempest in Kumo's space. All right. Okay, I'll stop sharing there. And that's where my paper ends, and I'm actually halfway through the course. So I don't really know how the course is going to end, but it's proceeding okay. So thanks, everybody. And now I'll become Ruby again. So let's have a discussion about those two final papers, as well as the previous three. And we have about 15 to 17 minutes to go in our time together. So feel free to put your hand up, or just take yourself off mute and contribute your thoughts. Yeah, Killian.
Thanks, John and Liam. Those are great. Liam, I particularly like the turn toward the pedagogical, one of the spaces where the rubber hits the road, right? Today and yesterday, I've been participating in this meeting based in Berlin, run by the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and the Anthropocene Working Group. And it's been this cool meeting of natural science and humanities and social science folks, but not infrequently, and perhaps not surprisingly, it has been a spectacle of people coming to loggerheads over kind of a natural scientist proposing a kind of fix or solution to an Anthropocene cycle, and a humanities person delivering a kind of critique to which someone else might say, that's all very interesting, but it's not very helpful for figuring out what to do about the Anthropocene. I really liked your line about the tempest as not an answer, but a thread that helps us find directions through the conundrum of finding and making meaning in the Anthropocene. I mean, I actually think I think that gets us actually a long way toward articulating the value of the work that we're doing in this context. And I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how you see or how you hear your students coming to an understanding of what it's good for to do humanities work in the context of a course like yours. Big question, I know, but it would just be so awesome to hear a little bit about it.
Oh, thanks so much, Killian. Well, I'm in new territory, and I'm loving it, and I'm halfway through. And since the course is subdivided, the rubber will hit the road probably from now on, as we really get the disciplinary experts in the room as well, talking about how you make meaning out of the Anthropocene through different angles. In a way, we've spent a bit of time on science and ethics, etc. The thing about the tempest, though, specifically, is that it's just such a great example of a clever artwork, even a sophisticated artwork that doesn't look sophisticated, but it's a brilliant piece of art. And so it's exemplary of the way art, or sophisticated art, maintains its value, even when the parameters are changing so drastically now, where we can't assume certain things about literary study that were considered automatic goods, like that say literary study might represent high culture and that's a good, or even that it represents the human or humanism and that's a good. Now, of course, what the course does is put all that into the planetary context where suddenly the goods that you're wedded to may not be good anymore, and the good changes. And so it's just really interesting then to put in front of the whole group artworks that have a level of sophistication where there's no straight answer, but you can see grappling with different aspects of the conundrum. And I'll be able to answer better at the end of the course, I hope. But the students seem to be getting it, but they do have to kind of join a few dots, and maybe in the second outing of the course we'll be better at joining the dots for them, although you wouldn't want to join them all up because then you're just kind of presenting a sealed narrative.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. That's great. Thank you so much.
So feel free to, I keep forgetting I'm chairing. Feel free to ask any questions or make any comments about John's paper or any of the other papers as well. Yeah, Peter, good to see you.
Hi, Liam. Hi, everyone. I'm Peter. I'm new to the forum, but I'm very grateful to be here and appreciated everyone's papers. I thought they were really terrific. I just had a thought on Beverly Sherry's paper on Milton and linking that to something that Claire said. I was sort of struck when I read Beverly's paper about the disruption of the soil by the fallen angels and how that was sort of representative of something which was really unnatural. And I thought about the idea of Genesis 3, from dust you shall come and to dust you shall return, and that was a natural sort of way of things and the sort of reaction we have against the idea of exhumation and disturbing the dead and disturbing the earth. And I remember Claire spoke about the bones becoming coral, so that sort of similar act of what is dead becoming something alive again and something renewed. And I wondered if the sort of terrestrial sort of idea of unnaturalness is sort of disturbing the soil and mining, what is the sort of marine equivalent? So what would you say is sort of an unnatural process in the marine environment, Claire, which you have sort of thought of in your research?
A really interesting question. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. And wonderful to hear the linking of the papers there as well. Thanks for that as well. Examples of unnaturalness in a marine space. I think probably Killian will have more to say on this than I will as well. I mean, well, obviously, I guess it depends how you're describing what's natural and what's not, right? So if you're thinking about humans as being unnatural in a marine environment, then human bodies, shipwrecks, anything like that would classify as under that kind of framework. But you might not want to go down that route. You might not want to kind of simplify in that way, that kind of quite black and white binary between what belongs and what does not belong in the blue space or in watery spaces. So I think it's a tricky question. I don't have a clear answer for you. I mean, in relation to the Tempest, you also have the addition of the supernatural, right? So that's a different aspect of something that's not natural in perhaps the conventional sense that we might want to use that term. So you kind of have potentially three things operating there: the supernatural, the human, and the more than human, perhaps to bring in a different way of thinking about natural versus human, which can be quite a problematic way of dividing things up. So I don't really have a clear-cut answer for you. I probably just made the waters muddier to go with the metaphor.
I just thought it was an interesting sort of parallel thinking about
It is.
you know, the terrestrial and the marine, and how you can sort of draw the links between the two.
Yes, absolutely. And I think complicating those links as well would be a really cool way to deepen this discussion as well. Yeah, thank you. I hope that answers it a little bit. I'm sure others will have more to add to.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, so Killian, what do you think on this one?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's a really, the question that it raises for me is the really kind of complicated history of the idea of marine naturalness, which I think has a really long and vexed history, right? So thinking about the early modern period, right, we can think of, I mentioned Thomas Burnet earlier on, a kind of physico-theological view of the ocean as a kind of repository of the detritus left over from creation, right? The idea that the ocean is in a sense always already like really unnatural. And if by natural we understood a kind of divinely designed landscape, right? Or natural order of things. So I don't know. I mean, I think in my limited, you know, within the variously limited scope of my knowledge, it seems to me that over the past few hundred years, one of the things that we can see is the sea being sort of reimagined over and over again, refreshed almost as a kind of premier site of the nature of the wild, right? Often in a way that's quite amnesiac about the fact that, as Claire mentioned, the sea has always been anthropogenic in all these ways, right? From the impact of fishing to the impact of shipwrecks and other detritus, etc. So yeah, so I guess that's like a non-answer, but I guess I would just say that the natural ocean is always a kind of discursive and ideological formation that's doing particular work in particular places. But I do think that deep sea mining, to come right back to your question, I do think that deep sea mining is, you know, one very contemporary, interesting way in which the sea is seen to be becoming unnatural. Bleaching, which Claire brought up, is another good example. Acidification, I think, is another good example. And there are obviously many more. I mean, commercial fishing being perhaps the kind of exemplary one.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We're just about out of time, but Kerry, you have a question or comment?
Yes. I'm just for those who don't know me, I'm rewriting my thesis on Gertrude and Hamlet for publication with the help of some extremely useful constructive criticism from my readers, for which I'm very grateful. My interest as far as this is concerned is, I've got two elements of interest. One is the unweeded garden. And in that context, I was particularly interested in Bev's article, which was talking about the gardener as Adam and Eve. And also, Liam, your course, which was talking also about responsibility, communal responsibility, as whose responsibility is it to weed the garden? Because it can take gardens a long, long time to become unweeded. So I think who is neglecting the unweeded garden that is traditionally read as Gertrude's body, I think is quite a good question. The other question I'm interested in is Gertrude's role as earth goddess. And I was particularly interested in all the Christian iconography that we had about trees. And I was wondering to what degree that crossed over with the pagan stuff that was being lost at the time, and whether the Madonna was related to this in any way. And of course, Elizabeth placed herself as the earth goddess, if you like, of England. But the most interesting thing, most intriguing one of that was in John's discussion of the opera, the forest as becoming vibrant and alive with that music at the end sounded very goddess-like to me. So it's the unspoken stuff in the production that can be the earth goddess and the presence of the female.
Thanks so much, Kerry. Sadly, we don't have Victoria here at the moment, but I'd love to hear John's thoughts on that, because I also was thinking about it was just such a moment when you were speaking, John, when you were talking about that evocation of the insects and and that rich life of the forest. And afterwards, then I started thinking about, well, what are instruments made of? What does this mean when you think about instruments as a form of products from a life?
Yes. Two things. Salieri and Nicolai are both unusual in their dealing with night and dealing with the forest. So Verdi, for example, and Michael Balfe, who was in 1837, another Falstaff opera, both have characters saying that nature sleeps at night. So that it's okay for us to do this because the forest is asleep, and nothing in the score contradicts this. Whereas both Salieri and Nicolai make it quite clear that the forest is very alive at night. And in relation to the goddess, there is something odd going on in that there's also the Titania scenes with, particularly in Nicolai, with the Anne Page equivalent being Titania. So there is a kind of supernatural thing which is separate from the natural. And in terms of the instruments, they don't really do anything interesting with the wood. So by the time you get to Richard Strauss with Daphne, when Daphne turns into a tree, the violins turn their bows round and play the strings with the wood of the bow. So that's a late romantic or early modernist, however you want to look at it. So they are Strauss does make an issue of the materialism of their instruments, but neither of these operas I deal with do that. We are still being transparent about, or we're putting to one side what the instruments are made of.
Thanks so much, John. We've got a couple of minutes left if anyone has any quick comments or reflections to add before we wrap up. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to thank everybody for being part of this. It's just terrific to see you all, and I'd like to thank our speakers as well, because I think it's been a fantastic sweep of different angles here on this broad topic, and it's been really brilliant work, and it's great to see it all out there as well, going out in publications and being shared in conferences and also the teaching. So that's great to see as well. So I hope you've enjoyed EMLAC for this month, and hopefully we'll see some of you again at a future EMLAC. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Liam.